Hello and welcome to today's webinar. We're going to take just a few minutes here to give everyone a chance to jump on. I see a bunch of attendees being added right now, so welcome. We're glad that you're here. Today's webinar is a Kochava Foundry webinar. Kochava Foundry is the strategic services arm of our business, and today's webinar is on retargeting do's and don'ts. So we're going to talk about what mobile advertisers get wrong and how to get it right. We'll take just a couple minutes here. I see a bunch of people being added. I want to point you to the chat window on the right side. We have Leslie Amadio, who is our community manager today, and she will welcome you and answer questions if you have them. But we would love to have you jump on and tell us where you're joining from this morning. And we'll get started in just a few minutes here. I'm going to kick off with some housekeeping items. I'm Kimberly Manning. I'm the VP of Marketing here at Kochava. And today's webinar will be recorded. We always send the recording out after the webinar, so you will have access to jump back in and review anything that you missed or to share it. Let's see, I'm going to actually share this slide here. And then I want to also point out the Docs tab, which is on the right side of your screen as well. We always tend to upload any kind of helpful documentation or additional information that might support you on this topic. And so I encourage you to jump over there and take a look at that. There is also a Q&A tab over there. If you have questions, we welcome them. We always find that the webinar is a lot more fun if we hear what you are most curious about. So don't be shy about asking questions. Jump over to the Q&A tab and enter your questions there, and we will do our best to get to all of them in the course of the webinar today. So it looks like we have a pretty good quorum here. I am going to welcome our speakers today. So good morning. We have Grant Simmons, who is VP of Kochava Foundry, and Seth Turnland, who is a senior data analyst with that same group with Kochava Foundry. And I'm going to turn it over to them to kick it off here.
Hi, thanks, Kimberly, and thanks everybody again for joining. This is, we've been doing this series here about one every 6 weeks or so for the past year and a half, covering a lot of different topics. And I just want to reiterate a couple things that Kimberly had talked about. First off, ask your questions. The reason is that we will answer all of the questions even after the fact. We'll publish all of the questions that were asked and all of the answers to those questions. So if we don't get to it in the session today, not the end of the world. We will get those questions asked. Usually takes us about a week to sort of pull it all together. So watch this space. If you're here, you'll be getting some communications. So with that, let's jump into what we're talking about today, which is mobile retargeting. And so very specifically, what sort of retargeting are we talking to? We're talking about mobile retargeting today, which is generally meaning an ad-served SDK delivered ad for the purpose of driving a mobile conversion. Much of this may be web to app, some of it might be app to web, but generally we're talking about mobile DSPs driving mobile reengagements. We're not going to get into individual sources or publishers. We're not going to get into cohorts, targeted audiences, things like that. What we're talking about today is how to best use your MMP tools to get goal alignment between yourselves and your publishers. And so with that, and having set the stage, Kimberly, if we could bring up the first poll question as we continue our conversation. So with that, I'm curious on, for those who are retargeting, how many partners are you using? And so for the publishers, answer this question. I see we've got a bunch of publishers on today. This is generally pointed at the advertisers. But let's take a look at the poll here real quick. We'll see. And so we'll continue while you guys are looking at that. And so to further make a definition around retargeting, it's largely a strategic effort. And it's a strategic effort around what I'll consider a key marketer challenge, which is you understand intrinsically that the customers who have raised their hands to your brand are likely better than the average customer. So when you run retargeting campaigns and you serve those folks with ads, you see cost per installs and cost per actions that they typically look great, but you might not believe the results. And so we've done a ton of strategic consultations around retargeting, and we've seen this dynamic time and time again. And so we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about the problem. And to do that, I'm going to bring in Seth, our lead analyst, who's sort of a mad genius in this space. And we're going to set up the problem. And then from there, we're going to get into the tools that are available to mitigate. So we're going to get really into the weeds. And then the last part here is I just want to make a shout out to the relevance of the partners. These are the ads, the folks who actually serve the ads and manage the demand side of the equation. And so we're talking folks like Archie and UAPI, Remerge, Addictive, and the like. And so those mobile retargeting partners are willing participants and need to get fed data, the right data on the right cadence to be able to do their jobs efficiently. So it also extends to social. It also extends to open DSPs like the Trade Desk, things like that. But through our consultative experience, publishers are typically willing partners, and they want to be more efficient as well. So there's lots of options to do that. All right, we got some results coming in. Looks like in terms of the mode, most folks are not running retargeting right now. So this will be hopefully pretty fascinating for you folks. And then of the folks who are running it, it looks like most folks are running with multiple partners. And so hopefully you'll get something out of this as well. Cool. All right. With that, I'm going to go back to sharing the slides. And Seth, I'm going to turn it over to you to sort of help frame the problem a little bit better.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a couple problems listed here. And we're not going to be talking about some of the fundamental configuration issues you might run into when you first start doing re-engagement. Rather, I want to talk about when you've been doing re-engagement for a while, or if you're starting to do re-engagement and you want to understand what are some of the warning signs of some deeper problems with your re-engagement configuration. The first one is that your re-engagements are really cheap. Now, we want cheap CPAs, right? We want to get as good a deal as possible, but there's definitely too much of a good thing. And if you are, for example, a QSR and you're able to get mobile orders for, re-engagements for, let's say, 50 cents a piece or something like that, or even cheaper, or you're a hotel company and you're able to drive these conversions, these converted users to getting these hotel packages for $1 or $2, it's very likely that the re-engagement settings are simply too loose, and you're getting a lot of organic traffic being converted into re-engaged by the attribution system. And another way you can look at this is re-engagements are simply too common. Having lots of re-engagements is great. You want networks that are driving lots of re-engagements, but again, you should be suspicious about how many re-engagements you're getting. You want your numbers to be accurate as possible. And I think that's a fundamental part of what we're going to be talking about today is you want your attribution to actually represent reality, what's happening under the surface. You don't want it to look too good. You don't want it to look too bad too, but that's less of a problem with the considerations we're going to be talking about today. So I think these are two pretty common problems. Clients will come to us and say, hey, we're doing too good and it's just suspicious. What are we doing wrong? How can we make sure that we're getting this more accurate? Now, I will say that if you're just not getting any re-engagements at all, we could absolutely have that discussion at some point. We get that question as well, but I would say these surprisingly are the most common questions we get. So these are the general problem areas we're going to be talking about today. Some of these are issues with configurations in your MMPs that can be dealt with there. Some of these are conversations you should have with your networks, and we'll discuss which is which. But one issue we see is networks that are all hitting the exact same inventory. So if you have any given user that's getting served impressions by, let's say, every single one of your partners on any given day, it's unlike what you're doing is you're competing against yourself, and you're going to be driving far too many re-engagements. You can think of each partner's actively re-engaging a user with impressions as you're serving data points to your MMP in a sense that are going to serve as the foundation for a re-engagement. You want those impressions to be strategic, and you want your networks to be able to have their own cohort that they can focus on rather than each of your networks that are kind of serving across the board. So the second one is, the second problem we see oftentimes is networks will win an association, and then that association is carried on for months or even years. There's a certain point at which the network association to or an attribution to a device just isn't relevant anymore. And that's a conversation you should have with your network, but it's also something you should just make sure that you have baked into your reporting. If a network won an attribution 2 years ago, and that device's post-install events, their conversions are still getting credited to that network, you probably want to address that. So we'll talk about that. The next time is cooldown, cooldown between re-engagements. We want re-engagements that show up in your MMP to represent something. They should represent an actual marketing effort and then driving a converted user. So if a user gets re-engaged every 2 minutes or 5 minutes, or users getting re-engaged dozens of times a week, at a certain point, this is just losing relevancy. Like, what does that even mean? So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about what's that cooldown period, how do you implement a cooldown period between re-engagements. The next one is look-back windows. This is probably something you've heard your MMP harp on a lot, and that is we want to make sure that your impressions and clicks are being windowed so that they're only used by the MMP for the amount of time that you consider them useful. So, for example, 30 days for a click might be a little bit too long, right? How long is a click actually relevant? And then the last thing is data sharing. And this is a little bit of a live wire when it comes to discussions with networks. Sometimes the data you're sending back to your networks absolutely is helping them kind of tune their system. But we have a discussion around what data should be sent to networks and when, and what conversations you can have to ensure that that data isn't incentivizing the wrong thing. So I think a major theme of this is that sometimes you have your marketing team and you have these re-engagement campaigns that you're launching, and you have the marketing team has an idea of what a re-engagement represents, right? It represents a strategic advertising campaign that a user sees, responds to, is re-engaged in the app, and then converts into a paying user. However, when you log into your MMP and you look at numbers, what you're actually seeing are basically a set of technical rule sets, which are taking two different data points and connecting them together. So what you want to make sure is that those two things are the same thing, because it is absolutely useful, and you can move on to the next slide. It is absolutely possible that what the marketers think those numbers represent, or even the network thinks those numbers represent in the MMP, aren't what they represent. So the discussion today is, how do we get those two things to conform?
And that's a bit of an abstract concept, right? And so what we're going to talk about largely for the rest of this is, what are the actual tools that are available to do everything that Seth had just mentioned? And the 6 things that you see listed on your screen, they'd be available in any MMP. We'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in Kochava and how you actually configure these things. But I would argue, if you take nothing away from today, these are sort of the 6 levers or tools that you can use to manage your re-engagement strategy. So with that, let's jump in. The first one that we talk about is the event association window. And so actually, Seth, I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, so when we talk about event association, what we're talking about is when a network wins an attribution, that device is now associated with that network. So any downstream activity happening after that install event or re-engagement event, all of that activity is going to be associated to the network for some period of time. So for example, a network drives a user into an app, they then register. Great, that network re-engaged that app. And so all of the activity after that register event for some period of time is going to be associated to that user. So in the screen here, we have network 2, very creative name. I created these names. very creative person, and they drive a re-engagement. They serve an ad, and then there's an app open that's re-engaged. And then we have a conversion event and then another downstream event, and those are associated back to the network. However, after some period of time, that device's activity defaults to unattributed or organic, however you want to say that. Now, that window is a configurable window. Now, I don't think there's necessarily a correct window, but you should have a window set. And that window should be something you talk about with your networks and that you talk internally. How long is a network driving a re-engagement? How long is it actually relevant? And this will absolutely change by vertical. When you have verticals that, let's say like mobile games or something like that, you might have more aggressive re-engagement strategies. When you're a QSR or like a car dealership or something, re-engagements might be less common and they might be harder to get. And so you probably want to reward the networks with a longer period of time where those downstream events are associated to them. Yeah. However, I think a big mistake is just not having one set. And then what you're doing is, as you go longer and longer in time without having that window set, more and more of your users are attributed users, but those attributions happened months or possibly even years ago. And at some point they're losing relevancy and your marketing efforts are looking too good because you have so much attributed traffic.
Yeah, and this can be shrunk to seconds and minutes. It can be expanded into weeks and months. So there's a lot of optionality here, which is really good news. And more good news, this can get managed at a very granular level. So it can get managed at the partner level, the tracker level, sub-publisher level, things like that. But, Seth talks about it as, well, the natural question is, well, what should it be set to? Mm-hmm. And, in my opinion, the answer lies in your own LTV metrics. And no two brands are going to look exactly the same. But testing around the timing prior to when you expect folks to lapse versus lapsed is often a tactic we see. But again, not all apps have the same sort of demand curves and life cycles, and sort of the compulsive nature or continual nature, depending upon that app, really drives what this should look like.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got a quick question here. I'm popping in there.
Yeah, great question. So I can talk about the default behavior in Kochava. If you use a different MMP, the behavior might be slightly different. In Kochava, by default, the event 3 is going to be going organic. It will not be going back to the original install source. And that's actually an important.
After what time frame? It depends on the time frame you set, right?
Right. I'm saying once that time frame has elapsed, it will then default to organic. Yeah. Yep.
All right, let's move on to the next one.
Default functionality.
Real quick. Min time to re-engage. Now this gets we start to get a little more complicated here, because if you're sort of paying attention, you'll kind of quickly get how all this stuff works together.
Yeah.
But this is after an app has been re-engaged. How long should that re-engagement be owned by that second source, right? And so the challenge here is, if you're not thoughtful about this, there's lots of instances we've seen where networks will just juggle a device back and forth within a very narrow time frame, which at that point you're largely just sort of measuring randomness. And so if we think about kind of what this guy looks like, is, in this case, we see a device was served an ad after installing, triggering a re-engage conversion of that app open. And that's awarded to a second network. But for how long should those events be awarded to that second network before it's again released to be a retargeting opportunity? And if you're not being thoughtful about your MTTR, well, what you'll see is, as folks are just naturally using your offering, they're just trading re-engagement attributions back and forth across a couple networks, right? And so this plays really, really closely with timing, and the timing you set on each of these award periods, along with all of the events that you're posting back to the network, right? And so you'll see it later, but if you're posting back every single app open, then you're probably sprinkling a device with a lot of non-causal ads. Anything else? What else is going on here, Seth?
Yeah, and I think there's another important concern here, and that is there needs to be a baked-in delay to ensure that organic activity is correctly labeled as organic activity. what we will see oftentimes is organic activity, and we'll talk about this more later when we talk about the data syndication part near the end. But if somebody installs your app organically, their buddy says, hey, install this app for this QSR, we're going to go down the street and we're going to order. You don't want them 5 minutes later making an order and then suddenly being reengaged, right? That's an organic install. So there should be this delay period between some organic interest in the app and when you want networks back into that user's business, in a sense, and reengaging them, right? Now, maybe that's a day, maybe that's a week, maybe it's a month. It really depends on your vertical. There's a lot of caveats here, but what we really want is for you to have a strategic vision of, okay, a user performed an event. When should this user be reached out to be reengaged? So, for example, a great example I had recently with a shopping client at online sales was, okay, if the user has something in their cart for 3 days, then we want the network to be able to reach out. But if that user adds something to cart after an organic install or something like that, organic product search, we do not want that person reengaged for at least 3 days, because that could be organic activity. We don't want that credited to a network, because we think that might be an organic event. We don't want that mislabeled. So maybe that's 3 days, maybe it's a day, maybe it's a week, but you want to have this kind of mindset of, okay, this user should not be reengaged. And it might be preserving organic, but it might be preserving a network. If a network reengages a user, you don't want that network doesn't want another network maybe stepping over their work and getting credit. So yeah, I think the way you presented it is very good, but also the organic aspect I think is very important.
Yep. At what point is it natural behavior? Yep. The next one, and mea culpa on this one, this should largely just be look back windows, because you've got some optionality in terms of what is the attribution credit in terms of timing that you're willing to award both an impression and a click. Seth, I'll let you sort of jump into this one first.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is pretty foundational, and if you worked with the MMP or talked to the MMP rep for a while, they've probably harped on this, and that is, we need to establish a baseline for how long a engagement should be considered causal. And there's kind of two parts to the look back window. The first one is when you're talking about deterministic attribution, let's say based on a anonymous ad ID like the AD ID or the GA ID, however you want to say it. That's the deterministic part. And then there's also the probabilistic part. When it comes to deterministic attribution, so you're certain that this ad was served to this user, there has to be a time where it's not relevant anymore. I was on YouTube, let's say last weekend. I'm sure I saw ads. I don't know what I saw. I didn't click on any of them. So are those ads still relevant? Yes or no? And I would say to a large extent, and it does depend on the type of ad. It depends on the type of engagement. It depends, there's so many, it depends. But the shorter the better. I'm always consistently trying to get my clients to choke back those look back windows as short as they can stand, and not the other way around, because in many ways, accuracy is simply better than quantity, in my opinion. And when you're talking about probabilistic attribution, it's kind of its own set. The longer you wait, the less accurate it is. So this graph kind of shows 4 different trends we see with networks. And what we're doing is we're grouping 0 is effectively when the ad happened, and then this is hours after the ad happened when the install happened. And for network 1, that's what we would say a very healthy network. So you have an ad served, and then you have a pretty quick fall off of when those installs are happening. So that activity, that driven activity, is happening really close to when the ad happened. The network 2 here shows a little bit of this delayed response as for much longer drop off. This is probabilistic traffic that isn't choked back enough. In other words, the look back window is too long. At a certain point, there is an initial response, but then when you get too far off, that probabilistic attribution is kind of just randomly attributing. So that's non-responsive traffic. That's just kind of random traffic. The third one, actually it's labeled network 4, is completely random, right? So this would be something like if you've enabled IP attribution, IP only attribution, or something like that. And there's no response to the ads at this point. It's simply whatever IP address happens to send an impression, and then if that somebody from that IP address happens to land. So you're going to get completely random, no response. That's very likely to be very poor quality traffic, or it's organic traffic that's just happening to get attributed. I included network 3 here at the bottom. This isn't as common, but it's just a strict fraud signal. So this is synthetic clicks, synthetic installs. When I mean synthetic, I mean they're just spoofed, and you're just getting this constant attribution across the board as these virtual machines kind of just kind of do what they do. But the first 3, I think, are the most important here. You want that response, the network, the attribution events, to be happening as close to possible as the ad. And one way to do that is choking back that look back window and ensuring that networks are rewarded for having user activity close to the ad that they're serving.
And again, there's a separate window to be maintained both for the impression or the click, depending upon sort of what you're trying to do. Typically, all things being equal, the impression should generally be very short relative to the click, based on the engagement. But yeah. All right, let's move on. This next one is think about this. Yeah, as an advertiser, think about this as what are you giving your partners? And to reiterate, those partners are critical, and you have important first-party data to share with them in order to ensure their efficiency and effectiveness. But this is a dynamic we see quite a bit. If, let's say, in this diagram, after an install, we're looking at an organic post-install event like a menu search in a QSR app, right? And so somebody's in the app, they've installed the app, and now they're actually they've hit the menu area of the app, and that as an event gets posted back to networks. Well, immediately the device starts getting served lots and lots of ads, and oftentimes from multiple networks, right? And so if you've got a pretty small cooldown period and you're posting back largely what I'll call continuous or organic events, then you're going to start attributing organic behavior, right? Because in this case, these devices are going to get starting to serve ads for the app. And if an order confirmation happens and they actually make an order after that menu search, that downstream activity is going to get awarded when it wasn't really that causal to the media. So that's my setup. Seth, I know we see this one quite a bit.
Yeah, we absolutely see this one quite a bit, and it can be pretty bad in regards to how prevalent it is. So it's not uncommon to see someone do an organic install or an organic event, and then minutes later be an attributed user base, or maybe an hour later at the max, because they did some organic activity, they closed the app, they opened it 5-10 minutes later, and in the meantime they saw an impression that was attributed. So this graph on the right is really common. And what we're seeing is the green represents network association of a given device. This is a single device, and I've seen this on many different apps, this framework, and you see that this user is just bouncing back and forth between 4 different users. They're always associated to a network. Sorry, 4 different networks. They're always associated to a network. And even in the same day, you will have the association change from one network to another, sometimes between even 3 networks.
Yeah, so just a quick call out. All of this ad serve activity to a single device was triggered off of that one event. In this case, a menu search in a QSR app.
Yeah, right? So in this particular case, the user, which I didn't include here, the user did an organic product search. Then minutes later, they were re-engaged. And then that user's association just started bouncing back and forth all these different networks for months, actually. I took only a little part. Now, that's a bit of an extreme example, but it happens a lot. And even if it was 1/100th this much, it's still too much. Because at this point, we're not actually measuring re-engagement. In a sense, we're measuring how well network ad servers can win an attribution from an MMP. Now, I'll say two things about this. The first one is this generally happens when there's not an open dialogue between the advertiser and the network, and there's some misunderstanding of how all these different parts are playing together. And I think a lot of networks that I work with on my client's behalf are more than willing to rectify this immediately. And oftentimes they think, because on their side, their system might already be kind of dealing with this, and they have different methodologies. So they might not even understand that this is happening per se. They might have these timeouts on their side. But in the MMP, because that's what the way the settings are made, settings are configured, the advertiser is seeing this kind of bounce back. And if you're not really looking at it, it can look like super successful re-engagement. So one way to deal with this is choking back those data streams to different networks and saying we're not going to share everything with you. We're going to share something, a much smaller data set. However, if networks are able to implement on their side these delays that you agree on, then sending a fulsome data stream might be great. It will inform their advertising, but you just have to make sure that those those delays, those cooldowns are being implemented correctly. And if they are, fantastic. And then that's something you should check once a month, just to make sure that that's happening.
Yep. Eligible re-engagement events. I'll let you set this one up, and then I'll come in.
Okay, so this is one that's particularly, I guess, worrisome to me. We really have to understand, what is a re-engagement? If you're an advertiser, what is a re-engagement? What are you going for? I submit that you're going for a network driving that user into the app and performing something mid-funnel or down-ish funnel that shows that they are now a more engaged user. However, so many people, when they set up these re-engagement trackers, will just add all events. The problem with that is that very high events, including app open events, are relatively easy to get triggered. For example, if you click on an ad, oftentimes you're just going to immediately deep link into the ad, right? Universal links in Android and iOS will just immediately open up the application. As soon as that application opens, sometimes before it's even foregrounded, there's already an app open event sent to your MMP. And so somebody clicks on an ad, it opens up the app. While it's opening, they just close it because that's not what they wanted. And now you have a re-engaged user because the event the MMP is configured to look for is just an app open event. On the Kochava side, it'd be called a session begin. However, on different MMPs, I'm sure there might be a different term for it, and different custom configurations might turn something different. So what I would say, the biggest change you can make in re-engagement is don't re-engage on session begins or app opens. Just don't do it. You want to see the user get into the app and perform something that indicates that they're interested in the app, not just that an ad was able to get them to open the app, even if they close it immediately. So that's basically what this is you probably don't want a re-engagement event to be really deep funnel, like, oh, they converted into the highest level of subscriber or something like that. But you also don't want it too high. You want to find the happy medium of, okay, the network demonstrated that this user is now interested in this app and is converting, is doing something meaningful. And then combined with your minimum time to re-engage, that network has a period of time with the event association window, has a period of time where they can earn that lower funnel event from the user continuing to express interest in the app.
Love it. Love it. Let's jump into the last one. Mm-hmm. Network inventory overlap. So this is the amount that, for lack of a better term, you're kind of stepping on yourself in terms of ad delivery as an advertiser. And I'm just going to jump straight to the data. And this one's a bit of an eye chart. Well, let me walk through it a little bit. So if you look at that first line, what we see is there were 3 publishers, 3 networks, and in this case, 1 or 2 or maybe all 3 of them are actually retargeting networks, but it doesn't have to exclusively be, such that there were 3 networks that served a total of 113,000 impressions to about 2,500 users, which resulted in about 86 downstream conversions. So in terms of efficiency, that was 1,300 ads per conversion. And you can compare that against sort of the other profiles. And so on an individual device basis, that can turn into some ugliness, such that you look at that Venn diagram over on your right, and you'll see that the 3 networks, in terms of all the ads that they served, you look right there in the middle, there were 233 instances where all 3 devices served ads to the same network, right? And so that's not great on its own, right? It's maybe not terribly efficient, but what's very interesting is if you start to look at the sub-publisher level, and what you'll see is 2 or maybe even 3 ads serving ads on the same app, and you'll see a much different performance profile across all those 3. So what I would say to this is it's important to look at that overlap. There's options to mitigate that overlap. There's options to mitigate it at the sub-publisher level, and in some instances, you may actually be bidding against yourself on individual placements. Seth, what else you got here? Anything?
Yeah, I would say here fundamentally, going back to one of the very first slides we talked about, more re-engagements is not necessarily better. At the bottom, we're not looking for really cheap CPAs. We're looking for revenue, right? We want to generate as much money for our company as possible. I think sometimes we substitute CPA as a proxy, as a simple, easy to understand proxy for how well we're doing. But what we can see is you have cheap CPAs and you're paying many, many, many CPAs, but those CPAs in total are representing a relatively small number of users getting re-engaged and performing activity. So I hesitate to use CPA as a proxy unless you are filtering it through some of the things we've talked about. Otherwise, you'll get to the case where you might have a CPA which is half as much as it was last year, but you kind of have 10 times as many CPAs, but you don't really have that much incremental user growth or engagement, right? That's kind of the trap you can fall into. You're kind of optimizing for CPAs, but you're optimizing against the accuracy of your attribution profile. So understanding something like this, having multiple networks trying to re-engage a small amount of users can end up with users being re-engaged so many times, but their actual activity in the app, maybe it would have been completely the same if those networks hadn't re-engaged that user after the first time, right? So we want to make sure that we're not optimizing for CPA, we're optimizing for profit. And we understand that CPA can be a good proxy, but it's not always a great proxy, particularly if our configurations are simply too loose.
Yep. Those are the 6 sort of levers and tools. And so generally, and I think this is actually a great time. We've got a question in the chat here. And I suggest maybe we use it to talk about, well, how does this all fit together? And we can talk tactically about sort of what that looks like. But, I'd kick this off starting to talk about like retargeting DSPs, but this is really applicable for the self-attributing networks, for the integrated DSPs. And Seth, let's just talk about really quick, well, how does this work on, let's say, a SAN like Google or Facebook, right, where you have an integration? So what I'd say to just start answering this question is good news. Your MMP is going to have an integration with these partners. There's a suite of APIs that are set up that allow data to be shared. And when it comes to Google or Facebook or any other self-attributing network, it largely comes down to the campaign and the tracker setup. And so, Seth, I'm wondering if this is a good time to talk about acquisition versus retargeting trackers at the DSP level.
Yeah. So, and I can absolutely jump in here. So the first thing, just to answer the question, and then I'll get into a more general thing. You are going to have a bit less control over your campaigns in your MMP when you're talking about large SANs like Facebook and Google. However, what you can do in the MMP is make sure that the settings that you have set up for these networks conform to what you want, not what the MMPs kind of have as their default. So for example, you could still set lookback windows. That's super important. Make sure that you have that set for Google and Facebook. You can still set event association lookback windows. Make sure that just because Facebook wins an install doesn't mean they should be having those events associated to them 2 months later, right? Having something like the minimum time to re-engagement rules in place so that any network that wins a re-engagement, whether they're Facebook or whether they're a small niche network, that they have a set period of time where they can earn that downstream conversion potentially. I think that you want to just make sure that you're treating Google and Facebook just like another network. And most of what we've talked about today still applies. Now, the conversation you can have with them, the personalization you might have with like the inventory versus a smaller network, it's probably not as good. But most of this still matters. And this is what I'd say when we're talking about kind of let's integrate all these thoughts. You don't necessarily have to use all of these, and your current settings might be fantastic, right? So you might not have to change anything. However, I think what you want to do is be very intentional about all of these settings, both within your team and also with your network partners. Because if you really understand what's happening in your MMP, you'll be able to understand the numbers on the charts better, and making sure that those conform to what your campaign strategy is actually hoping for or working towards, right? You want those two things to conform.
Yeah.
If you look at all of these and you say, I don't know any of these settings, right? Maybe you inherited the configuration, right? If you've been working with the same MMP for 5 years or 10 years, you might have inherited all these configurations. And it might be a little overwhelming, and I would recommend not going in and changing all of these right away. However, what I would do is go take maybe one a month and look at how you're currently configured, look at how it's working with each of your networks. Let's say which events you're re-engaging on. Look at your trackers, find that report, talk to your rep at your MMP to find out what your settings are, and then have a discussion about what it should be. Then make that change, wait a week, 2 weeks, a month, and seeing how that's impacting your re-engagement. Then move on to the next one. And if you do all of these, look at them, review them, maybe accept what you have, maybe make changes over a quarter, I guarantee you that at the end of the quarter, you're going to have much more accurate. Or maybe it's the same, but you'll understand the numbers much better, and that'll definitely help downstream optimization.
Yep. This is a great question. Thanks, Jay. How useful are frequency caps and suppression lists in avoiding the ping pong effect? Very, very useful, limited effectiveness. Anybody who's been in this game for long enough knows that frequency caps are very, very hard to manage, especially, and we got to talk about somewhat the elephant in the room, iOS. And what I would argue is app tracking transparency in the StoreKit ad network has made it really, really difficult for marketers to be efficient around retargeting. The ability to maintain a suppression list that's accurate on iOS to understand who not to serve ads to has become increasingly difficult. The ability to retarget to iOS devices is really difficult. Anybody who has their solution, I suggest that you pull the thread on that a little bit and find out what it is. Oftentimes they're getting targeted to a pre-14.5 OS universe, which is sort of a weird, shrinking, biased population that doesn't really represent iPhone. There's lots of funky math around factoring up on what's observed on Android. There's lots of different solutions, but within iOS, because of the privacy changes, it's really, really difficult to run suppression. It's really hard to run frequency caps. It's a lot easier on Android. And so the natural question then might be, well, what is available for iOS? And the answer is there's not a lot of great options. We're on SCAD 5, quote unquote, which is known as the ad attribution kit, and that does have some significant tools for retargeting and re-engagement on iOS. But in terms of a publisher basis, very few publishers are capable of what is SCAD 5. In fact, most publishers are still on SCAD 3. So having said that, still using that first party data to be able to maintain suppression as much as you can and understand the overlap across your network partners to be able to limit frequency is still a worthwhile exercise. So that was a long answer to a short question, but I figured we needed to talk about the iOS.
Yeah.
A little.
So actually, if I may, I'm going to say one thing about that last really quickly, and that is, Jay, they're great if they're implemented and working. One thing I just want to caveat is always put reporting in place to verify that whatever strategy you're using, whether that's network side or MMP side, that it's actually working and that it's actually being followed through. I think that's a really important part. A lot of these strategic efforts are great, but that doesn't mean they're actually technically being implemented.
Yeah.
So here's a new question. How do you mitigate duplicated reach in our mobile app retargeting campaigns? And what best practices would you recommend for a fintech app? Okay, so two different questions here. So the first thing is there are tools on the MMP side to mitigate it somewhat with duplicated reach. There's things like MTTR, right? So that would be you're ensuring that anytime somebody's winning a reengagement, that no other network can kind of take that away. So that definitely helps kind of the ping pong kind of aspect. However, I would say out of all of the things we discussed today, ensuring that networks are serving as unique inventory as possible is going to be primarily a conversation with your network partners. And it's one of the things where you can use your MMP somewhat to kind of segregate it. But I think that what you can use your MMP more for is to identify that the problem exists and then talk to your network partners about how they would best solve that, and make sure it's an open conversation. I think that things like suppression lists could work, audience lists could work, maybe region.
And again, that comes down to hydrating your network partners with your first party data. And there's lots of opportunities to hydrate them outside of just the postback mechanism and allowing them to sit on some of your data to better retarget, to better carve around or otherwise suppress. It's oftentimes a good idea, and again involves a partnership with the publishers themselves. In terms of the second part of that question, which was, what does this look like for fintech? Again, it largely comes down to sort of what does the LTV metrics look like on your brand, meaning of the events that you're tracking, assuming that this is an app that we're talking about. You're likely sitting on the data historically to understand when does drop off happen, when do I want to start either pre-mitigating or actually mitigating in terms of re-engaged ads being served to this individual. And that it could be very close, very, very upfront, or it could be, we have a much more considered sort of engagement, and it could be in the terms of months in terms of when to start getting those ads. So the good news is there's some LTV analysis available to help figure that out and give you some testing periods. Yeah, iOS, it's going to be largely through. The question here is we had talked about probabilistic attribution for retargeting. How does that work, especially for iOS devices? You'll see a lot of it in a lot of different contexts. And this is we could talk about this for the next 3 hours, but I'll see if I can simplify. Generally, it's going to come down to a shared IP address around timestamps, right? Meaning it was understood generally where an ad was served from and where a conversion happened in terms of those probabilistic signals. But having said that, it's again on iOS, it's very, very difficult. In fact, that IP capture has largely been redacted as well. And so you'll see a lot of other options on this. One is the social partners like a TikTok or a Meta will model conversions, meaning they're getting feedback in terms of conversions to claim from, specifically from the MMPs. And in terms of those conversions, they'll start to model the conversions that they think they actually drove, even though they might not have the signal to be able to do that, because they've got so much data behind that firewall. So very useful. It helps you understand sort of overall volume, but the trick there is ferreting out, well, what did, in this case, let's say Facebook observe versus what did they model? And the good news is there's some tools to understand that as well, and that sits in the advertiser postback. So again, iOS, super challenging. A lot of it comes down to a partner by partner basis on what's available, but there are some tools available. Anything else there, Seth?
No, I think that on iOS it's definitely tricky. If you're talking in general, a lot of the probabilistic we do would be something like a CTV, IP only, but CTV. A lot of big CT providers like Roku or something similar. And then when it comes to Android specifically, in general, probabilistic works fine on retargeting. It's just pretty standard. It just uses device characteristics to kind of match it. It's a little messy, and that's why you want a shorter look back window as possible. So this one's so just from Roland again. Thanks for the question.
I'm going to go back to this slide really quick so we can talk to it here. Yeah, if you pop that Roland question again.
You talked about the ping pong effect. I was wondering if CRM-owned media activities would increase its effect. I assume yes. Is there a best practice to separate paid CRM retargeting? This is a fantastic question. And I think that this is very different at different clients I work with. There's some clients I work with where it's a relatively small team, and so you have owned and you have paid, and it's kind of the same team, same efforts, or maybe they're two different people, but they're reporting to the same manager. And in that case, there's a lot of incentive to ensure accuracy. There's other organizations where owned could be a completely different department versus paid. And sometimes those relationships can be relatively antagonistic. I think that fundamentally what the teams have to work towards is accuracy. That's it, right? Sometimes there's an incentive to say, hey, I want as much owned attribution as possible because, then I don't have to pay my networks, right? But anything you do to decrease the accuracy of your attribution is going to increase your cost. It may not increase your CPA, but it will absolutely increase your cost. So I think that what you need to do is just commit to just treat your owned when it comes to attribution like any other network, and try to find what is actually happening with my owned versus my paid. What is it actually driving, and try to get at that. And resist the temptation to loosen up the rules on owned a bit. Keep them tight, right? Because you don't want your owned, you don't want to think that your owned is like particularly good, because it's like, man, we're doing so well with our own media. Let's just cut spending on our paid media. Well, if your owned is like really wide open on attribution, and then your paid is like really narrow, so maybe more accurate, you're going to be making some choices which could absolutely hurt your downstream revenue, because you're going to be cutting off paid sources potentially that are very beneficial. So I would say you don't necessarily have to separate them, but make sure that you are using the exact same measuring stick with both of them. Look at both with a critical eye, and if you do want some subset of your users to not be targeted, most network partners do allow for suppression lists. But again, if you do put a suppression list in place, let's say these 10,000 users are strictly we're only going to touch them with owned. Great, give your networks those lists, but then continually be verifying that that's being implemented correctly. Mistakes happen. There could be some overlap. So anytime there's a suppression list in play, there should be a report in play, and you should be making sure that those are actually being the suppression lists are being obeyed. I hope that answered the question. Grant, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, own media is always sort of tricky. It's when I was on the brand side, I would always want to understand the conversions touched by my owned media, such that I want to have the option to be able to give owned media the first bite at the apple. Meaning I have the right but not the obligation to actually award that. I want to know about it, but I want to potentially expose that for the purpose of a paid network. But for me personally, I always want to know the breadth of conversions my own media is touching, whether I want to award that or not. I want to have as an option. That's a lot to manage, but that's been my experience. Let's see, we got time probably for one more question. Our users create accounts but don't use the app after. How do we find out why? The answer is probably in your data. There's a longer answer there, but in terms of breaking down what is the make, model, what is the operating system, what is a good cohort look like versus a bad cohort, what's the sources of media that's driving these, is there fraud? And it's, digital ad fraud is still the second largest criminal organized enterprise on the planet, right? And it just so happens that we and the largest both call our customers users, right? So it could be that something's getting manufactured here. We're in the middle of a couple of those cases right now. So there's a lot going on here, but looking at the sort of expected performance profile of post-install events that would happen within a reasonable pattern versus the exceptions to that is probably where I would start. Seth, what do you think?
Yeah, so the first thing I would do is there a marked performance difference between attributed and unattributed? And if there is it different by different attribution sources? Because if the app is working correctly, the first thought that I go to is, okay, well, make sure you're comparing your internal diagnostics, what's happening in the app, with what your MMP is reporting, because sometimes it's just there's an integration issue. And so you're not getting the events you think you're getting, and that can be validated by internal reporting versus what your MMP. So, but assuming that that's working correctly. The second thing is, if there's a difference between organic and paid, and it's a market difference, for example, organic are relatively prone to going pretty deep in the funnel in the app, but paid, particularly from a single source, just creates a count and then leaves. That's actually pretty common. And I would say, is that source getting paid out on CPA of creating red accounts? Because that would be where my head goes immediately, would be something like that. However, if they're exactly the same, organic and paid are exactly the same, that's a good question. And that's something we could dig into. Unfortunately, there's just so many branches that I could take from there. It could be something like what I would do in that case. I would say,
fortunately, because there's a lot of data available. And
yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of data,
in there
100%. And that would be a great thing to have for like a paid trial. Like if you can get 100 people to use the app and then just report it honestly, and that's assuming there's no fraud. That's assuming there's no integration issues. And at that point, just being investing the time for actual user trials, for authentic users, rewarded users to use the app and give authentic feedback, because there could be some blocker at some point. For example, maybe after the create account screen, it says there's a button there that takes them to the website inadvertently that you're not really thinking about, and then people are using it on the web instead of the app. There's just so many different options there.
Opportunities. There's so many different opportunities.
We're down to the last 2 minutes. I want to remind everyone, if you would like to continue this conversation with Grant and Seth, the fastest way to do that is to click that request consultation button that you see up in the corner. And also in the Docs tab, there's a link to the Kochava Foundry website page where you can learn more information about what services they provide. And there's a link in there to one of our Ad Tech Trends videos, which is a series that we do that Grant just dives into different topics that are typically of interest to audiences like this. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, and we post all of those Ad Tech Trends videos there as well. We have 2 minutes left. We've got one more question I was going to pop in here for you guys if you wanted to try to see if you can answer it quickly. This is from
I saw that last question. I wanted to write out my answer for this one. Yeah. There's a big answer to this, and we will write it out and complete. Yes.
Yeah,
the short answer to that first.
Yeah, let me jump in really fast.
The question then is, what do you do about it? Yeah, go ahead, Seth.
Opt-out users. The best thing you can do is look for trends in your opt-in, your double opt-in users, and then try to extrapolate that to the larger audience. Obviously, that's not necessarily going to be a correct answer, because double opt-in users are probably a fundamentally different cohort than opt-out users. So be warned there. If you're running very similar campaigns on your iOS and Android, you can use, to a certain extent, your Android cohort to kind of identify the characteristics of your iOS opt-out users. Again, there's some tricky there. iOS users are, to a certain extent, fundamentally different than Android users. But if you can use your double opt-in users on the OS side to kind of understand what those fundamental differences are, you can kind of use that to scale the Android traffic to get a better idea of what's happening overall. Oh, 45 seconds.
That was impressive.
One of a few different solutions, but we'll write out some
There's
other.
a lot I could say there, but
that's
45 seconds worth.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for joining us. We are right at time, and we so appreciate all the questions that you sent in. We look forward to seeing you on the next webinar.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.